Hello to all watching, women and gentlemen. Every civilization sees a fall and then its subsequent rise. When the Indian Republic was born, we had Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru as the first premier of the country. Humanities is a forlorn sibling in the Indian discourse. And so much of what was actually there gets lost in the noise. Today, we have Professor Madhavan Palat. He is a former professor of Russian and European history at the CHS JNU. He has been a visiting professor of imperial history of Russia at the University of Chicago and editor of 41 out of 100 volumes of the selected works of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Welcome, Professor Palat, to the Ramjas Political Review. I'm Prem Ansh Sinha, editor-in-chief. Professor Palat, according to your arguments in India's first global thinker, Nehru in Comparative Perspective, Nehru's nationalism was not against the West. Rather, it was an attempt to create a universal Indian modernity based on global ideas. This brings to surface an epistemological tension in his vision, balancing cosmopolitanism while maintaining a distinct identity of the Indian civilization. Do you think this attempt of Pandit Nehru was teleological or overtly idealistic?
You're saying, was it overly idealistic to be completely without an other, is it?
Right.
Not opposed to any other. That's the point?
Right, sir. Right, sir.
The kind of argument that Yogendra Yadav was making recently in the newspapers.
Right.
Is that the point?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Nehru did attempt to have a nationalism which will not be hostile to any other nationalism. In other words, not to have an other to which it is opposed. That is, no othering, as they call it. He did attempt that. He tried to be inclusive all the way. So his nationalism was inclusive. Now, he had no internal enemies. This is the important part of his nationalism. Secular nationalism did not tolerate internal enemies. It sought to unite everybody within the territory of India. All the other nationalisms within India had another and other. Be it Hindu nationalism, which it obviously had Muslims and certain others, Sikh nationalism, is opposed to others. Muslim nationalism, the same way. And all the way in all the other regional nationalisms. The whole of India is composed of a series of nations. Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Karnataka, Andhra, you name it. They're all nations. They may not be sovereign independent nations, but they're still nations with all the features of a nation. And India assembles all these nations into one larger nation. So all these different nations have others to them. Nehru attempted through secular nationalism. Secular nationalism alone claimed that there should be no other. That is, it is not going to create an enemy of anybody within the country, or for that matter, outside the country. Now, this has faced criticism by theorists of nationalism, who argue that if you have a nationalism, it has to be distinct from another nationalism, and in principle, therefore, opposed to another nationalism. There has to be the other. So how can you have a nationalism without something else? How can you include everybody without ever positing an enemy? This was Savarkar's point against secular nationalism. He said it is absurd. You can't do it. So you have to posit an enemy. Now, if that argument is valid, the question to ask is, did Nehru have an enemy in mind against which Indian nationalism was posited? Or was it just a wishy-washy nationalism too idealistic as you put it, which did not have an enemy and therefore could not be a real nationalism. It had to be internally weak, unlike all the other tough nationalisms. Now, if that is the case, what was the strength of secular nationalism? And how did it turn out to be so potent as to lead the independence movement and also to dominate Indian politics for more than half a century after that, after independence? What was the substance of it, if it was meant to be so hollow, as its critics claimed? I would say it is not as hollow as that, and it did have an opponent in view. We don't talk of it as a nationalism. It was British imperialism, and with it all imperialisms. Now, we think that imperialism is not the same as a nationalism, because the word is different. And the British always pretended that they were not nationalists. It was only a pretense. They were the most extreme nationalists, the first industrial nation, and so on. But British nationalism and British imperialism were melded. The imperialism was a continuation or an extension of its nationalism. And there's no way the British nationalists of those days could think of themselves except as imperialists. Without an empire, there was no Britain. Britain cannot identify itself. And even today, they have great difficulties of seeing themselves without an empire. And therefore, they preserve the image and so many of the value systems and so much of the rhetoric of empire. You could even say one of the reasons that the Queen was kept for so long and so successfully, and the reason for the continuation of the monarchy with all its pretensions, is to be a reminder of empire. It's maintaining the image of empire. Commonwealth is one of the ways of doing so, and so on. Okay, so if the empire be seen and imperialism be seen as the other, then it makes sense.
Right.
Secular nationalism did have its opponent. When it was uniting all Indians, true, but it was uniting them against imperialism. It was not trying to unite Indians against a domestic opponent, which is what all the other nationalisms were doing and are doing. This was its strength. And that is the reason for its success also, to the extent that it had success. It failed with respect to Pakistan, that's true. But that's because there was an overriding geopolitical argument for the British to partition the country. And their argument throughout was the machinations of the British led to the partition, not the faults of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. All the other Indian nationalisms blame one of the Indians. Curiously, they never blame the British. They always blame one of the communities. Muslims blame Hindus, Hindus blame Muslims, Sikhs blame one or the other or both. Only the secular nationalists actually clearly point their finger at the British for wanting the partition of the country and for inflaming these nationalist competitions. So nationalism was not an empty-headed idealism, a hollow idealism of that kind. It was strategically calculated to unite Indians against imperialism, which is what all nationalisms do. They unite the country against somebody. Here the somebody was clearly located outside, and that one was a British nationalism equal to British imperialism.
That answers my question. So, Professor Palat, in your lecture, The Spiritual in Nehru's Secular Imagination, you emphasize Nehru's deliberate refusal to formalize secularism as a rigid doctrine, noting that he distrusted the word secular for its potential to become a source of dogma, instead opting for an ethically grounded, spiritually balanced form of political reason based out of his assumptions of self-sufficiency and the segregation of religious domain. Some scholars suggest that it was secularism that gave rise to the wave of communal politics in the 1980s and 1990s, while others say that had the secular principles been more rigid instead of being left vulnerable and under institutionalized, the course might have been different. These are two extreme point of views. With your extensive study of the Nehruvian architecture, where do you find yourself there?
Oh, I disagree with both positions. Uh, Nehru was not rigid and dogmatic in the least. And the other extreme demand that he should have been more dogmatic hardly holds water. Let me explain what makes him secular and what is the grounds on which he is secular, what his principal arguments were. See, his purpose was, number one, to overcome religious conflict. And the second was to deal with the problem of religion at another level altogether, that of irrationality in a modern world. They're two different ones, yeah? They're related. But let me take the first one, the problem of overcoming religious conflict in a country that has to be united to fight off British imperialism. So overcoming religious conflict was an overpowering imperative at that time, in the first half of the century. And after independence, it was still important to preserve the unity of the country and ensure its independence so that it doesn't go through further partitions and further internal conflict. So uniting the country and by overcoming religious conflict was immensely important. Now, it was not due to any disrespect of religion as such. He may not have been religious, but it is not due to disrespect of it. As far as he was concerned, the problem of religious conflict was to be solved by asserting and ensuring the fundamental rights to the freedom of conscience, of assembly, and of expression. These are the fundamental freedoms which were already proclaimed in the Rights of Man during the French Revolution and have been repeatedly proclaimed throughout the various revolutions in the course of the 19th century, in Europe and elsewhere, and in the 20th century, after our Constitution was formulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, in a sense, that had become a fundamental premise of all liberal societies which seek to unite, that they have to have the freedoms of conscience, assembly, and expression. The freedom of conscience means the freedom to believe in anything you wish to believe, which means any religion. So in a liberal society, it is guaranteed the freedom of religion. Religion is therefore respected. It is not denied. That's the first position. And the freedom to express yourself openly in your religion is also allowed. Not merely allowed, it's enforced, that freedom, through association and through expression. You're perfectly free to propagate your religion. You can express your religious beliefs. You can assemble to do so. And privately you can exercise your conscience, freedom of your conscience. So it's part of a liberal order. And it has been the premise of all liberal orders from the time of the French Revolution. India is doing nothing new. It is merely reasserting those principles. And the United Nations did so again. So all individual and group activity have to be compatible with a constitution which lays down these principles. And in this, the rights of the citizen are superior to those of anything else, to any groups or anybody. So the individual citizen is the one whose rights have to take preference over the rights of any groups. Groups may, of course, assert their rights and express their rights, but only to the extent that they are compatible with individual rights. The rights of the citizen are fundamental. It is superior to all else. The Constitution does guarantee both individual and group rights, but the individual rights are superior. That's absolute. So, if the freedoms of religion are guaranteed in this fashion, one religion does not have a right over another, doesn't have an advantage over another. They all have equal rights, just as individuals have equal rights. And the principle is that each one is permitted to exercise its rights as long as it does not infringe upon the rights of another. That's the fundamental principle. As long as you can exercise your rights without doing so, it's perfectly acceptable. Therefore, that's all it has happened. That's all that has happened. But it has been represented as him not respecting religious faith. It is represented that way because those who think that one religion should have superior rights over another always complain that they have lost rights. They haven't lost rights. They have the same rights as another, but they want superior rights. They want an advantage over another. And those are the ones who complain that he does not respect religion, that he is a hater of God or he's irreligious and all these other things. Nothing of the kind. He's not bothered about all that. His point is, you can believe whatever you wish, but don't impose it upon others. That's all. Now, if all religions exist like this and one is not superior to another, how does a religion exercise its freedom? It functions within an autonomous sphere. All of society consists of a series of autonomous spheres, of which religion is one. And the state regulates those relationships and their functioning in exactly the way the state is empowered to and required to and we expect it to regulate every other sphere. We expect it to regulate the entire field of corporate activity, don't we? Otherwise there'd be complete chaos. We expect it to regulate a domain like sports. That's another autonomous sphere. Autonomous means internally they have their own rules of functioning, which is respected as long as that does not violate any fundamental rights. The academic world is another autonomous sphere, and one of our constant demands is that the state should respect the autonomy of the academic world. And it functions best when it is autonomous, but regulated by the state. Without regulation, nothing will work. And this across the board. Any profession, any sector are all subject to state regulation and state leadership. But that doesn't mean state direction of its internal functioning. That's all it means. So religion is just one of those autonomous spheres. In fact, if I can push it to the extreme, crime is another autonomous sphere. It functions on its own, by its own rules in a way, and the state practically regulates it and participates in it in one way or the other, in practical terms. If you look at the story of gangland warfare, the state is not independent of it, but that's pushing it to the limit. Now, so the religions now are made autonomous. They are no longer the regulatory principle of all of society. The Constitution is a regulatory one, not a religion. Many people think that religion should be, and especially their own religion. Instead of which they find that they are subordinated to the Constitution. Nobody prevents them from observing their religion and propagating it, but the Constitution is superior, that's all. And that is all that secularism means. Yeah. And this process of secularization has been going the world over. And it was not dogmatic, therefore. Regulating relationships, regulating the functioning of these institutions are all necessary so that they do not violate the principles of the Constitution. But he had another objective in view, which he considered essential to the modernization of the country, which is that his intellectual concern that people should not be embedded in any form of irrationality. And blind faith, if you can consider religion an aspect of blind faith, is one of those. So blind faith, superstition, or any form of acceptance of principles which have not been subjected to scientific investigation, that he considered irrational. You want to arrive at the truth, use a scientific method. And if you can, that's fine. If you claim anything which cannot be subjected to scientific method, you're being irrational. And it must be open to everybody to investigate it. The procedures by which you find out to arrive at any truth have to be universally accessible. Anybody can look at it, understand it, and it must be comprehensible to everybody. There are no mysteries to knowledge, all of it. These are all basic 18th century principles of the Enlightenment, which he was applying, and which we all accept. These are things we are taught in school with the greatest regularity. All the science that we are taught in school is precisely this. And the science applies to all forms of knowledge, not what school children call science, namely physics, chemistry, and so on. And that's not science. That's only one part of science. History has to be scientific. Literature has to be scientific. Philosophy has to be. Namely, you have to go through a rational argument and provide arguments and evidence for what you say. And that evidence has to be subject to the tests of verifiability and falsifiability, to take it one step further. So he wanted to promote science as the best means to the approach to knowledge. And with that, religion took a knock. Those who claimed that this is our faith had to answer the question, well, if it is your faith, on what basis have you arrived at it? And then they get trapped. Because how do you say it is your faith? How did you get that faith? How is that you got the faith but not I? And why is that your faith is not accessible to me? Whereas the principles of physics or of chemistry are accessible to me or to you if I've studied it. So why is that the principles of your faith are not accessible, whatever they be? In which case, is it knowledge, is the question. And are you just indulging in some form of superstition? That was the question. Now, Nehru was not irreligious ultimately. He was respectful of religious feeling. And this is important to note. What he disliked about what we call religion is the priesthood, the dogma that comes with it, and the organization to enforce it. These are the things he disliked and he rejected because they created closed systems. You have no entry to it. And they do not speak to you. They cannot communicate with you. All closed systems, therefore, are anathema to him. On the other hand, anybody who is fully committed to a cause, 100% committed to a cause, in the manner that the truly religious were and are, he admired them immensely. If you're prepared to give your full life and your total concentration to any cause, you have what we'd call a religious feeling. And he appreciated that very much. And he gave many examples of that kind, including people like Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and so on. He admired it. And that's why he admired people like Jesus and Muhammad. He did not admire so much the respective religions. He admired certain people within them, like St. Francis of Assisi. He did all that. Buddha was somebody he admired enormously. I mean, he was practically a Buddhist, intellectually speaking. All that he did. So he appreciated religious feeling, what Freud called the oceanic feeling, and so on. But he did not, and he despised dogma. And with dogma, the priests who claimed to be the repositories of that dogmatic knowledge, and the organization that promoted it. That's what he objected to. Otherwise, he was fully supportive. Not supportive, he appreciated it and admired it in many cases. And he was even called religious by one of the Khilafat leaders, by Muhammad Ali. He said, I think you are religious, the way you function. He's got it in his autobiography. And Nehru said, perhaps I was. He's skeptical about himself in such respects. So he was not indifferent to it all. But he did not create a dogma out of secularism. Some others might have. But the ones who carried this to the dogmatic level, these forms, he wanted to be inclusive through these forms and ensure. The practical politics is that all minorities must feel secure in post-independence India, especially the Muslims would suffer the greatest trauma, and so on. That is a practical side of it. And he ensured that as best he could. And he said everybody must respect everybody's religion, and so on, and the state would regulate it. But the point at which what you call the dogma and the excess came is after them. When Muslims were used as a captive bank of votes, and they were a trade-off between their conservative leaders, their religious leaders, and the votes. With the result, no investment was made, no further investments were made in their education progress and so on, because the conservative leaders did not want that. But they got the votes, because Congress claimed that they were the only protectors of Muslims. That is after Nehru. He himself did. And that is what led to the enormous campaign against the Congress for what they call pandering to Muslims and so on. That's a different story.
Right.
But it has nothing to do with secularism in the real understanding of it.
Professor, in the same lecture, you explain how Nehru not only appreciated and admired Buddhism, but also incorporated Buddhist symbols due to his firm belief in the Buddhist principles of ethical self-regulation and scientific temper. How much did Nehru's beliefs in Buddhism, according to you, influence his initial perceptions of the Chinese people, the PRC, and his engagements with Mao's CCP?
How much did he believe in Buddhism?
No, how much do you think his belief in Buddhism shaped his perception?
Or affected his attitude to China?
Right.
No, I don't think the two were related.
Okay.
He had a very positive approach to China and expectations from it on multiple grounds. The long civilizational association between India and China, and of course Buddhism was the connection there, but many other aspects to that civilizational connection. And he saw it as the sort of China and India as very comparable. They had about the same length of history, vast territories, internal diversities. Of course, China had less diversity than India. But finally what he expected them to come together on was that both are victims of imperial domination in the 19th century, and both fought to throw it off in the 20th century, and therefore they would come together jointly in the campaign against imperialism That's what he expected. Now that expectation was belied in the form that China became hostile to India, saw it as a competitor, and went to extreme lengths to attack India when India had no such expectations whatsoever. Now, the geopolitical reasons for China doing so are heavily discussed in all the literature, as you know. But I can certainly suggest two aspects of that. One is that when China finds herself isolated, one way of, and India when it finds herself isolated, and they find that India is feeling triumphant, or somehow in India, that India has an advantage over China, then it's a warning that China gives to India. Don't take advantage of our temporary isolation. Now, between 1960 and 62 this happened, when the Soviet Union and China split up. And India saw itself as now in an advantageous position. America was friends with India. Soviet Union had broken with China and therefore was realigning itself. India would have certain advantages. And at the same time, India was host to the Dalai Lama and accepted the Dalai Lama, which the Chinese were nervous about. And there was, of course, strong suspicion that India might be the launching pad of a Tibetan insurrection. Not that India did anything about it, but there were those fears. And when you have fears, they become material facts. It happens. So they gave a warning to India in the form of the 1962 attack that we can assert ourselves against you and you will not have the friends that you expect you have. And that proved to be right. India was in a helpless situation. It could not face that invasion. But not that anything happened. Chinese just came in and went out. It was something, a bit of a slap in the face, but no more than that. It did it again in 2020, the Galwan episode. When Trump attacked China, and Indians, there's a certain sort of feeling in India that China is now isolated. Till now, China was almost an ally of America. And China has prospered so enormously because of that alignment with America. Now, if that was breaking, and China is out on her own, as Trump's policy seemed to indicate, then India now felt more celebratory. So China once again attacked, which they hadn't done in between. Between 62 and 20, there's almost nothing. So suddenly this strange attack occurred. So in both cases, it's because of a geopolitical situation, nothing to do with unreal expectations. And if it is unreal expectation, then Nehru was up in the head in the air and all the rest that is said of him. What have all the other prime ministers done? All the tough ones. Everyone is very tough and proclaims himself very tough, or herself very tough against Nehru. But they all faced exactly the same problems. Nothing has changed on the ground. And the lineup globally is exactly the same. In fact, things have become slightly worse today than it was then. So it's nothing to do with Nehru's false expectations, his idealization of China, his naivety, his weakness, none of those. Because everybody who came after him are all tough people, or at least proclaimed themselves to be very tough. Not a single change on the ground.
Right.
And the same with Pakistan.
Right. So let me interject you with an unstructured question. I remember watching a conversation of yours with Mr. Jairam Ramesh on the release of his book on V.K. Krishna Menon. It was published by the Tribune, if I remember it correctly. You say, and Mr. Ramesh agrees with it, that the 1962 war was more of a military failure than a political failure. So can we can we say can we not say that military successes are not political successes? They are military successes. So how do we distinguish between the two? How can we say that a military is not a part of the political will?
Yeah, I agree. That's an artificial distinction to say it's a military failure, not a political one. They are necessarily related. The thing is, Nehru's political strategy had been laid out very clearly. That there is no conflict with China, and if there is going to be tensions and you have to build up the armed forces, well, the only way to build up the armed forces is through a successful industrialization of the country, which will enable you to sustain a large military establishment. A poor country cannot maintain a military establishment of the dimensions people expected. It cannot supply it, it cannot find the munitions, the arms, and all the modern technological gadgetry. So he said, we need all those. We will have it. We do need a modern army. But the only way of getting a modern army is to go through a successful industrialization. It's not a matter of just buying equipment. It's like the famous case of you don't hand over computers to monkeys. So it's no use just acquiring more and more hardware. You have to be able to keep it up in a war. And the only way is to produce them yourself. To produce them, you need such a huge industrial establishment to do so. So that is why he gave the priority to industrial development and for the rest to diplomacy, not to more and more confrontation. Now, but when the confrontation occurred, of course, the military failed. It could not succeed, though it could have done better in some senses. That's true. Now, if a conflict occurred, India is always the weaker, because India has chosen a pattern of development which is not the Chinese one. Democracy makes everything slower. We have to cater to so many different types of demands all the time. Chinese have just wiped them off the slate. I must remind you, China went through the largest famine in human history in the 1950s, in the Great Leap Forward. More than even the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union's industrialization famine under Stalin was about 5 to 7 million dead. The Chinese one was at least 30 million. That was the scale of it. India, on the other hand, has had no famine after independence. All the famines were before that. So priorities were different. And Nehru's consistent argument was that we cannot sacrifice one generation for the benefit of the next one. So we will have to go along slowly. And there's no way the military can be effective unless you industrialize effectively. And you're not going to industrialize effectively at such cost. That he was emphatic about. And he repeatedly brought up the Soviet example, saying, this is not a model we must follow. So there's no chance. If there's a conflict, we'll be the loser. That's true. That is in the kind of skirmish that China wanted. It's not the kind of conflict where you have a total war. If there's a full-scale invasion of India into India proper, that's a different matter. Then, of course, India has the resources to fight back. But the kind of war that China prefers to have, up on the mountains, for small pieces of territory, to make a dramatic impact, and then to withdraw. So far, that's all we've seen of China. There, India will be at the weak end.
So let me ask.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, you can continue, sir. You were saying something.
Go ahead, finish.
So let me ask you a question on one of your past answers, and of course, it's not framed very well as well, so I will be framing it in my mind while speaking. You said, no, can we say that Pandit Nehru's ideas about secularism emerged, or they find their root in the partition of India?
Sorry, secularism.
Was there any pre 1947 idea of secularism, and any post 1947 idea of secularism that got shaped by the horrors of the partition? Uh,
No, they were the same.
they were the same.
The ideas are the same, the fundamental principles are the same, the philosophical foundations are the same, and it is foundational to the whole of Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian strategy, of which Nehru adopted. That is, India must be united. Indians must be united,
Right.
against British power. So you have all of them have to be united, and secularism is one of the means of doing so. You have to unite regionally. You have to unite caste conflict, prevent caste conflict. You have to unite classes in conflict. About class conflict and the desire to unite the classes led to the left accusing them all of being sort of stooges of the capitalists. The desire to ensure the end of caste conflict, to prevent that, led to them accusing Gandhi of not doing enough to overcome it, or even Nehru. You see, their idea is that one Indian must not attack another Indian.
Right.
That is a fundamental principle. The moment you stir up one Indian interest against another Indian interest, the British have an entry point of dividing you and sponsoring one against the other. So, to prevent that happening, they had to keep on compromising. The Pune Pact with Ambedkar, for example, over the Dalits. Every one of these, they're always being accused of compromise. But compromise is what won the day. They united the country. Otherwise, you'd have had full-scale civil wars in India, and the British would have had a wonderful feast. They could pick up anybody they wanted, promote one against the other, like the Arab world. It would have ended up. And that's what was prevented. So, secularism was within that mold. Now, after independence, the idea, it is not enough to have independence, it is important to retain the unity of India.
Right.
Nehru didn't take the unity of India for granted after independence. He said, we never know. And there were so many challenges. And he constantly exhorted his countrymen to unite, exactly as before 1947. So secularism was required, or his secular policy. He seldom used the word, by the way. That's important to note. But it was required to continue to maintain the unity of the country. There was a foreign nationalism against whom they had to fight, British imperialism. That continued. And it's only when India became more confident of its unity, after it faced the Khalistani challenge, and after breaking up Pakistan. After both were done, I think in India it has been taken for granted now that Indian unity is secure. Nobody can challenge it. It's only after that that the secular nationalism has declined in power and the Hindutva nationalism has risen. It's from the 90s, after the Khalistani challenge was seen off. So the long-term consequences, or the long-term process, you might say, was that once the security of Indian unity was established, and still seemed to have been established, secularism waned, and Hindutva nationalism asserted itself. It has less to do with pandering to Muslim interests and weakness of particular leaders and so on. Those are all the short-term ones. The long-term, I would say, I put it this way.
So let me bring up another question, which is related to the partition of India as well. We don't have a lot of publicly available literature on what was going on during the partition. The focus was usually on the independence of India, but let me frame in this way. In your lecture at the India International Center, Nehru and Democracy, you pointed out that Pandit Nehru was always skeptical and to an extent doubtful about what he used to say. It can also be interpreted as he did not think in binaries. Did he ever publicly or privately reflect later in life on whether partition could have been averted? And another question attached to it would be, what do you think? When it comes to the letters that might have been written by him, what was his emotional response to the partition of India?
His he would have liked to prevent the partition, obviously, that we know. He thought the partition was an absurdity, the way Jinnah presented his demands. He said, he made all the arguments against partition. And he said, what if it is a question of Muslims having their own state and nation? He said, that is manifestly not possible. Whatever territory you take off, lop off, and make it Pakistan, there'll be so many millions of Muslims left in India. And there'll be so many Hindus in Pakistan. So that by creating a Muslim state, you are creating a minority problem within Pakistan. And you leave the minority problem within India. Nothing is solved. So it has clearly nothing to do with solving a minority problem. The way to solve minority problems, is said, is not by partitioning the country, but to mobilize your ideology against minority domination. That is why the partition was carried out in manifestly irrational fashion. An ignorant lawyer was brought out from London. He put a ruler to the map and drew a straight line.
Right.
And that became Pakistan. And it went through villages, in certain cases through certain houses, and so on. It's as silly as that. It is such irrationality, everyone thought it is impossible. Yet it happened because the British insisted on it.
Right.
So he thought it was impossible. But he also reflected the other side. He said, if Jinnah is going to be such a powerful presence, and after the war, Jinnah won all the elections in the Muslim constituencies. Of course, he won the elections because he and the communists were the only ones who were allowed to exist during the war and propagate their views. So the Communist Party became extraordinarily popular, and the Muslim League also became very popular. So the Muslim League tried out their communal riots, the Communist Party tried out their revolution, Intifadah and Telangana and so on. Both sides tried it. Of course, nobody is going to give the communists any chance. But the British were there to support the Muslim League 100%, and therefore they got Pakistan. And they both became popular because of the war. They were the only ones allowed to mobilize. Before the war, Jinnah lost everything in the 1937 elections. So Nehru thought, well, we can manage it. Then when he saw the degree of apparent popularity and the way it was going, and Jinnah was making it impossible to govern India through a series of communal riots, and the British were assisting those, like the Calcutta killing in 1946. It is then that he was convinced. And his own party were also convinced. And Gandhi said, if everyone wants the partition, then I am not going to stand in the way. Gandhi was asked, in fact, why didn't you carry out a fast unto death? And he said, if everyone wants the partition, if I fast unto death, all that will happen is I will die and you'll still have a partition.
Right.
He answered that question.
Right.
So, and Nehru's further point was, okay, suppose we make compromise after compromise and get a united India, which of course he was very doubtful about, because he saw the way the British were going. finally you'll get it at such a heavy cost that you cannot do anything in India. He wanted to develop a modern India, to carry out the huge land reforms and the social reforms, what he called the social revolution, and so on. He said with Jinnah at the helm of the Muslim League and them being run by landlord interests and so on, there's not a ghost of a chance. He'd be hamstrung.
Right.
He said, all right, let them have another country and we'll get on with our own development as we wanted. What nobody expected was that having another country would lead to these massacres.
Right.
1 million killed and 20 million homeless. And nobody expected that for the next, throughout their lives, there'll be a permanent war between India and Pakistan. That aspect of the Cold War they had not seen. That is maintained by the Cold War. And to this day it continues. Pakistan is a client of America. So, as a client, America maintains an army there. And it is a backward state which is exactly the same state as when the British left. Run by landlords, army and bureaucracy.
Shadows of the Great League.
It's gone so far ahead. But they need a client state. The army is there and it continues the same way. So, Nehru's point is, it's best that we don't have such a state with us.
Right.
We won't be able to do anything in this country. He had to carry out the Zamindari reform, he had to industrialize, he had to democratize, he had to have a proper democracy functioning. Would all that be possible with this kind of a politics, as you have in Pakistan? He said, perhaps just as well. But nobody foresaw that it would be at this cost. I think all of them thought, including Jinnah, that you'd have a partition and two states would just live as it were peacefully. Like India, within India, we've had a series of partitions with the states' reorganizations. Andhra has been carved out, Maharashtra and Gujarat have been separated, Punjab has been divided, the northeast so many states have come. There's a process that is going on still. UP has had parts of it hived off, Bihar has. This is a process that continues. It has never led to any warfare between them.
Right.
You create a new state and you just continue. In principle, that should have been possible. What's wrong with having a Pakistan if you want it? It doesn't mean you have to be at war with each other. You can just be there. Like Czechoslovakia split up.
Right.
Into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It's possible. And in all probability, Britain will split up. And so on. But that is all possible because there's an overarching union. There's a European Union above them. Spain might split up for the same reason. But the geopolitical situation was such that America required a client here. And Pakistan was the one. And that has structured a completely different politics.
So I have two more questions, and then I think Aryan has a question that he wishes to ask. So let me ask you another question on democracy. In your lecture, Nehru's Democratic Dilemmas, you highlight Nehru's deep dismay with electoral politics, with his description of elections as madness and his concerns regarding the submergence of real issues.
Submergence of?
Submergence of real issues. Beyond a moral fatigue, would you interpret this as a more fundamental critique of electoral democracy itself, particularly in its capacity to sustain reasoned public discourse within a post-colonial society like India? So that's what my question is, sir.
He had his doubts about democracy in this sense, and that was part of a basic critique of democracy that was going on worldwide from the middle of the 19th century, or late 19th century. And he found it applicable to India also. It is not a post-colonial problem, particularly. It's very much in evidence in France and Italy. In fact, Indian democratic politics is far more stable and regular than anything that France had to show until then. Only after 1958 did France become stable politically. Otherwise, the Third Republic, the Fourth Republic were all shocking. They never had a government that could last more than 9 months,
Right.
and so on. Italy was even worse. So it's not a peculiar problem of India, and it's nothing to do with post-colonial. In fact, I don't like the word post-colonial. Let's say independent India,
Right.
unless you want to call Europe post-fascist or something, which might be more valid. Perhaps it's not post-fascist; it is still fascist. Uh, the it is a fundamental problem in democracy that what we assume to be all the democratic values of public discussion of fundamental issues by a informed, rational public meeting in the public sphere, or the Habermas argument, for example, actually doesn't occur that way. Ever since mass democracy took over in various parts of Europe and India, in Europe from the late 19th century, in India from the Gandhian phase, a mass democracy does not allow for that rational, informed public discourse. It is very doubtful if it had occurred before. Certain range of it might have occurred, and I think that certain range of it does continue even now. But the raucous mass mobilization is so powerful that it overwhelms all the rational discourse that we are so keen on. People like Schumpeter have actually said it's not as rational as you imagine it to be, that many people who claim to be rational are, in fact, extraordinarily irrational. They are well informed, they are educated, they are intelligent, they have occupied senior positions, they are very experienced, but they are as irrational and populist or sort of irresponsible as any mobster. It's all in Schumpeter's argument. Many others have said so.
Right.
There's no reason to assume that an educated man is more rational than an uneducated man. The educated man might give more rational reasons. He may argue it better, but he's also driven by fundamental emotional requirements and self-interest as much as anybody else. Therefore, Nehru had all his doubts, but he said, we can work against those problems consciously. It is possible. And he said that is the only way we can work. If you try to restrict democratic expression, you're going to end up in a fascist mobilization, which is also democratic because it mobilizes the masses. But to be chauvinist, authoritarian, and violent. He said we can work against all that. Why can't we? And we should. Democracy has its problems, but it has its solutions also. And it's for you to work out the solutions. That's the meaning of what I said. The problems, if he faced problems in democracy, he saw the solutions as more democracy. Not to attack democracy and impose military rule or dictatorships. That doesn't solve any problem whatsoever. And it has never solved any problem. But if you can mobilize a political party which is democratically committed and to create more popular support, and parties are in competition with each other and they place their arguments before a public, you can do it. The point is to try to do it. And he kept on urging people to do so. And he wasn't wrong. It is possible. That's why we're all democratic. We all try to persuade each other that it has to be done. Otherwise, why are you and I having this discussion at all? I presume it is possible.
Right.
I presume we think it's possible. That's why we are trying to sort it out.
Yes. So before I move to my last question, I would like to open the floor for the audience. Aryan indicated to me that he has a question for you, which is quite not related to Pandit Nehru, but it's related to Russia, Ukraine.
Hi, sir. I actually had a question with regards to Russia because you also have learned Russian affairs. It was mostly to do with like an interview you given regarding Russia and Ukraine and how most of the causes of Ukraine is also to do with NATO enlargement. To put that aside, do you think there is a possibility of a direct Russian military intervention in case the US decides to directly get involved in the case of Israel and Iran, because the Russians have talked about this being a red line being crossed for them. So do you see this being a possibility as well, because Russia does not want the US to be involved in the Middle East?
I don't expect Russia to get involved in Iran, because Russia is having a pretty tough time in Ukraine as it is. And Russia herself is under attack from Ukraine. It's not only Russia attacking Ukraine. Ukraine has been able to periodically hit. Although Ukraine is at the receiving end, I agree. But behind Ukraine stands the whole of Europe and America. So when Russia is fighting Ukraine, it's not just Ukraine. And Russia can ill afford to open another front against Iran now, in Iran, where it'll have to fight directly now, and it'll be direct, against Israel. And Israel means America, because they have made it very clear that Israel will be defended at all costs. They're not prepared to defend Ukraine at all costs. They're prepared to let Ukraine do the fighting. They're prepared to let Ukrainians die, but just bleed Russia there. But they will not allow Israelis to die. At the slightest challenge to Israeli security, not that Israel has faced any challenge to security at all, but what they call a challenge to security, then they will counterattack. And then Russia will be at war with the US. But it will not, the US is careful about how much it will attack Russia. It doesn't want a nuclear exchange. It's not like Iran. Russia can always threaten a nuclear exchange, and they don't want that. But there are other ways of doing so. You can always get somebody else to do the attacking. You can get Georgia to do the job. You can launch it from Afghanistan in some way. I don't know, where there are numerous strategies open. You can just bleed Russia. And you can beef up Ukraine, actually. And if you beef up Ukraine, Ukraine can do such spectacular things as destroying entire Russian airfields, as it did recently. That would be the most likely thing it will do. So Russia is not likely to invite that, because it simply cannot afford a war in Ukraine and in Iran. Since it is doing not too well in Ukraine, it is just about holding its own. And if it tries to open a front in Iran, it will not merely have to divert so many resources into Iran. Whom will it attack exactly? It will have to attack Israel? Now that's dangerous, because it's going a long way to attack Israel. It has no launching pad nearby enough. And Israeli resources are unlimited because America is behind it. America just supplies Israel. And unlike the Ukrainians, Israel can use those resources perfectly. So it will be limitless. And the Americans also then beef up the Ukrainians. So it will be just what Zelensky would want. He'd be very happy. It will take the pressure off Ukraine, and as well as bring arms flooding in from America to attack Russia. The legitimacy of the attack upon Russia will be greatly enhanced. So no, Russia will not do so. It would be very foolish to do so.
One final question to you, Professor Palat, is that you have been working very extensively on Pandit Nehru for the past few decades, if I'm not wrong. There must have been some biases when you had started working on the selected works. How do you think your understanding of Pandit Nehru and idea of India has evolved over time? Do you think there has been any significant shift in your ideas? Did you have any preconceived notions that changed after spending years into the work?
Yeah, the bias I had was, like many people have, that Nehru was rather wishy-washy and at times not decisive enough. Well, when I read his work, and now I've been editing his work since 2011, so now about 14 years, I've, as it were, been sitting next to him, talking to him practically. I've read everything that he is writing, reading, talking about, thinking. I've watched him draft his speeches, his letters, everything. I've been more and more impressed by him. He was not at all wishy-washy. The thing is, his form of expression was slightly convoluted.
Okay.
It is not clear-cut. In fact, being a professor myself, I would not have given him A's for the manner in which he wrote. Very literary, but the quality of sharp argument is not the best for a man to pass an exam well. Subhash Chandra Bose, on the other hand, is perfect.
Right.
It is so clear-cut, so well stated. I can understand why he's succeeded well in the ICS exams. Nehru would not have, I think.
Right.
But the point is, Nehru was a deeper thinker. And he always saw multiple sides of any problem. And because of that, he expressed himself in a way that always led to qualifications. It was not emphatic and straight. He did not say, this is right and that is wrong. Of course, he did it at a different level. Communalism was wrong, yes, for example. Imperialism was wrong, yes. Anybody who attacked the unity of India, well, that is wrong. That sort of thing. But in everything else, he saw the complexity of an argument. In a country as complex as India, but reality is so complex and so full of contradiction. So he saw the problems, and in all those levels. And therefore he expressed those complexities, which is what we call being wishy-washy. And he sought compromise and consensus, which is what we call him as being weak and indecisive. His own daughter thought so. She was just that typical tough one who drew the line and said, not any further. She was that type. She was not a consensus builder. Nehru was a consensus builder. And for him, and he considered that absolutely imperative after the partition. He didn't take, as I said earlier, the unity of India for granted. So I've been more and more impressed when I see the complexity which he was dealing with. On the same day, he would have to deal with a fellow like E.M.S. Namboodiripad on one side, Kamaraj there, D.C. Roy somewhere, and good old Caron, who was the antithesis of all these people, and Sheikh Abdullah,
Right.
and all those UP politicians one after the other. He had to deal with the whole lot. And the way he responded to each, argued with each, so consistently and carefully, indicates high level of statesmanship. He was able to deal with Master Tara Singh and Fateh Singh and so on with the greatest rationality and coolness of head. Anybody else would have got fed up with them, the way they kept on at him. But he kept on replying to their letters, arguing it again and again, saying why he was opposing a Punjabi Suba, perfectly reasonably, rationally, all the way. He always tried to persuade people to his side. And therefore he didn't create enemies the way his daughter did. And that I was very impressed by. To rule a country like India, you have to bring people together. You can't afford a Leninist revolutionary situation. You're going to have civil wars. And it'll be extreme in India. You can't afford that at all. And he succeeded. He held the country together, brought people together. Everybody, he developed an undying consensus for democracy in India. We don't realize that. We take it for granted that we are all democratic. But what do we owe it to? The British claim that they created democracy in India. What nonsense. What the British had was fascism in India. What was created was by Indians against the British. But who consolidated it? That was Nehru. And we've taken that for granted to such an extent that we can afford to be so critical of him.
Right.
There's no danger of army rule in India. Everybody else has had it. The military don't. And there's no danger of direct dictatorship in quite the way that most other places have. I know we've had authoritarian regimes, but it's not the same as overthrowing the constitution and creating a dictatorship. Why is that no army leaders dared to take power in India? Democracy is firmly entrenched. Every leader in India, every political leader in India, you can say everything about them, but the whole leadership is elected. We might despise them as much as you want for all their inadequacies. But the one thing is they're all elected. And nobody sees any other leadership as a legitimate one. Nobody sees the army as a legitimate one or anything else. He created a firm foundation of law in India, as firm as we can possibly imagine. I know how lawless the country is. But the constitution was founded, it was grounded, the rule of law was grounded. That's not due to the British. British did not have a constitution, they did not have a rule of law. They had just a dictatorship. And what they called law was just arbitrary rule by them. It was not British at all. It's not an inheritance from the British. It's all created after that. And against very heavy odds. And the greatest achievement, of course, is one of the greatest achievements is the reorganization of states.
Right.
It has deepened Indian democracy, which at first he himself is afraid of. He is afraid it lead to partitions.
Right.
But the fact that now every part of the country can feel itself democratically assertive through its own linguistic state. It can assert itself through those processes by creating a nation within that linguistic area. Of course, India is blessed by having clear-cut linguistic areas. So each one of them can become a nation of its own, which is attached to the Indian nation. Everyone feels comfortable having both. You have the benefit of having your own nation as well as the superior Indian nation. You have a larger space in which to operate, but you have the security of having your own space. But partly it is good fortune, partly it is the creation of those early founding years.
Professor, I said that it was my last question, but I can't help but ask a very brief question to you. That we were speaking with Professor Quentin Skinner a few months ago, and he spoke that the very first step when it comes to writing something or reading about something, we must try to get into the archives. Since I clearly mentioned that you have been working on Pandit Nehru for the past few decades, how did you know where you should have started out with, where to begin with? Because there are a lot of letters, there are a lot of essays, speeches, available information. How do you know what should be the sequence? Where should you begin with? I hope my question is clear because it's quite unstructured and spontaneous. Sure.
Did you actually interview Quentin Skinner?
Yes, Professor Skinner. We did.
Okay.
Right.
Anyway, where to begin? This is a fundamental question that all historians face when they begin their research. Where to start? And many flounder when they enter the archive because it's such a massive detail, colossal amount. See, there are different ways in which people handle it. Each one does it in his own way. One thing is you go to the archives with a particular question in mind, and you go to the archives which seem to handle that particular range of questions. It could be, say, the problem of Kashmir, say. You want to write a book on that. And you go to the archives and find out everything about the Kashmiri question. And there will be a whole archive within the Ministry of External, if they will give it to us. They don't, but still, if they do, you will get it all, and you just begin reading it and go right through it, and then patterns begin forming in your mind. And on that basis, you will start formulating, you'll see the patterns and you'll formulate the hypotheses. And you'll read more and more around it again and again. That's how all historians do it. You can't get a ready-made answer from an archive. Your questions itself will change as you go through the archive in every way. You'll obviously have to go with some question in mind. You can't just go in completely open-ended. Then you won't even know which file to ask for. But even if you have a question in mind, that question will be drastically reformulated as you keep reading. But the advantage of just reading archives is patterns form in your head. You'll see what people are arguing about. They're constantly writing to each other, making representations, disputing with each other, and you will begin to see what the central problems are that they are facing, what they consider the central problems to be. And as you see that, you build up an argument about how they are analyzing the situation and how they are presenting it, right? And you will perhaps get out of this obvious attempt to explain it by personal motives and interests, or their class background, or personal prejudice, or any such thing. They're all grappling with the problem themselves. And how well are they doing it? You will keep seeing. And you'll see the structures come out of that. And that will give you a clue to answering your questions and giving you, allowing you to formulate a completely different structure, but starting from that, always. You'll have to read much more than secondary works around it. Over each thesis that you might formulate, you will have some hypothesis. You will seek evidence in this, but you have to read the secondary works around it. And you'll have to read the secondary works which are historical, philosophical, where appropriate economic, in political science, anthropology, religion, etc., as whichever the range of problems are, to see how these problems work out on the ground. And where these leaders, as they were trying to handle them, where they were heading, each one of them.
Thank you very much, Professor Palat, for your well-crafted answers. It was a delight to listen to hear you speak.